Now, one thing I want to say about the authorship question, this is a topic that sometimes leads people into almost getting into fist fights. Okay, so I'm just saying I hope we don't have any of those here. Uh, and I hope that even if we disagree after we've discussed all this about who actually wrote Shakespeare's plays, we should all still be friends because what brings us together is that we love Shakespeare. We love Shakespeare's works. And we're all interested in that, and that is a reason for being friends, whatever else we might disagree on. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about how I got started on Shakespeare. Not the Shakespeare authorship question just yet, but just Shakespeare. And it really started when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I read Charles and Mary Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare. Okay, I see heads nodding. Some of you have read that, right? When you were children, or you read it to your children? Uh, these are very nice retellings of the plots of the Shakespeare plays for children. And it was a very good start for me, a very good introduction, because when I was 8 or 9 years old, I knew what pound of flesh referred to. I knew who Romeo and Juliet were. I even knew who Beatrice and Benedict were. So it's a great way to get started, especially for children. And then when I was about 10, I saw a production of The Tempest on TV. That's Roddy McDowall on the left and Lee Remick on the right. Maybe some of you remember seeing that. But I was enthralled, and still it continued my interest in Shakespeare. In high school, I studied Shakespeare. Julius Caesar was the first thing. Later in high school, we studied Hamlet. Now, this is a picture from Laurence Olivier's movie of Hamlet. And this is where Hamlet is uttering that famous line, "I can't tonight, I have a headache." Now, of course, I also I went to Europe after I finished high school, and I visited Stratford-upon-Avon. And when I got to college, I took a full year course on Shakespeare and studied an awful lot of his plays, really delved into them. And there was something that really struck me in one of my textbooks, and it was by Lewis Wright, who was then the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library. And he said, "It is incredible that anyone should be so naive or ignorant as to doubt the reality of Shakespeare as the author of the plays that bear his name. Yet so much nonsense has been written about other candidates for the plays that it is well to remind readers that no credible evidence that would stand up in a court of law has ever been adduced to prove either that Shakespeare did not write his plays or that anyone else wrote them." Now, I had heard before that a little bit of mentions of an authorship question, that some people thought that Shakespeare didn't really write Shakespeare's plays. But what I took away from this is he says there's no evidence that anybody else wrote the plays. And I thought, well, if there's no evidence, then why is there even a discussion about it? If you think somebody else wrote the plays, you'd have to have some evidence, wouldn't you? And he said there wasn't any, so I took that at face value at the time. Now, I want you to remember that phrase. He said there's no credible evidence that would stand up in a court of law, because I'm going to get back to that phrase a little later. Now, a couple of years after college, I was an intern in what was then called the New Jersey Shakespeare Festival. Today it's called the Shakespeare Theater of New Jersey at Drew University. And didn't really think about the authorship question until 1991, when I was in an airport and I happened to see this issue of The Atlantic. And it was about the authorship question. And of course, I bought it because it was about Shakespeare. And I loved Shakespeare. I loved performing in the plays. I loved reading the plays. I loved seeing them performed. And so if there was some controversy about it, fine, I'm in. Let me read about it. So this magazine had articles by two people with opposing viewpoints. One who said that the Stratford man was the author of the plays, and one who said that somebody else was the author of the plays. Now, this was the first time I actually read somebody's argument about why they thought Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon did not write the plays of Shakespeare. And I wasn't necessarily convinced by him, but I could see why there was a question. And so I kind of left it at that, didn't think about it too much for a few years. And then around the year 2000, I was getting ready to enter law school, and a friend told me that PBS Frontline was repeating a special that they had done back in the late 1980s called The Shakespeare Mystery. And so I watched that, and it was very interesting. It gave me a lot more food for thought. I still wasn't necessarily convinced that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, But I could see that there were some sound arguments being made that you had to pay attention to, that he didn't write the plays. And one of the interesting things that I learned from this that I didn't know, and I don't know if many people know this, is that Mark Twain was a big skeptic of the traditional authorship theory. In fact, he wrote a whole book on it. It's called Is Shakespeare Dead? And it's the last book that he wrote. And doesn't get much attention these days, not as much as Huckleberry Finn. But I just want to make one point. While I happen to have this picture of the book up here on the screen, it says on the cover that it's by Mark Twain. And what that means is this book was written by a man whose name was Mark Twain, and he was born with that name, and he died with that name. And he had that same name all through his life, and there is no other possible explanation for why that name would be on that book. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this inquiry. Now, Mark Twain, in his book, loved to make fun of the epitaph that the Stratford man wrote for himself that's on his gravesite. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. Okay, well, that's nice, but it's kind of simplistic, both in its form and in its content. And a lot of us find it a little difficult to believe that this was written by the same man who wrote this. Aye, but to die, and go we know not where. To lie in cold obstruction and to rot. This sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clod, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice. That's from Measure for Measure. Now, let's take a look at a question that Lewis Wright, I mentioned earlier, of the Folger Library, brought up. And let's ask this question: why would anyone believe that William Shakespeare did not write the plays that bear his name? And I'm going to answer that question with another question. Do the plays really bear his name? And I'm going to answer that with still another question. What's in a name? You can quote me on it. Okay, and let's take a look at the name that was actually on the books, the poems and plays that were published in the late 1500s, early 1600s. The author's name was Shakespeare, the way we spell it today. Almost always it was this way on the works, and occasionally it was hyphenated. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But let's look at the records for the Stratford man. Well, his name was spelled Shakespeare when he was born. That's how it was spelled on the records. And when he died, they spelled it Shakespeare. Now, in the meantime, there were variations of the spelling: Shakespeare, Shakespeare, Shakespeare. And in the Elizabethan days, people were pretty flexible about the way they spelled things. So, you know, if somebody was writing your name, you told him your name, he would write it phonetically. It may not actually be the way you spelled it, and that was okay. But usually, the person himself would have a consistent way of writing his name. So it seems a little bit odd that the man from Stratford, if he was actually writing these plays and poems, would not conform the way he spelled his own name to the way it was being spelled on the works that were published. Now, if this were the only oddity in the Shakespeare authorship question, I probably wouldn't think too much of it, but really it's just the beginning. Let's take a look at the man's signatures. These are the 6 recognized signatures of William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon. As you can see, some of them look like he had some difficulty writing it, and actually it's been commented that they don't all look like they're written by the same person. In fact, Jane Cox, who was the custodian of wills at the Public Records Office in London, said in 1985 that it is obvious at a glance that these signatures, with the exception of the last 2, are not the signatures of the same man. Almost every letter is formed in a different way in each. Literate men in the 16th and 17th centuries developed personalized signatures much as people do today, and it is unthinkable that Shakespeare did not. Which of the signatures reproduced here is the genuine article is anybody's guess. Now, what Jane Cox doesn't say, perhaps somewhat diplomatically, is maybe none of these is actually his signature. Now, all of these signatures are on legal documents, so it's quite possible that a law clerk wrote in the signature for him because he had difficulty signing his own name. And if he had trouble writing his name, how did he write Hamlet? That is really the question. Now, unless you think that other Elizabethan writers had terrible signatures, here are some counterexamples. In the upper left-hand corner is Anthony Mundy's signature. To the right of him is George Chapman. Lower left is Thomas Dekker, and lower right is Michael Drayton. Not sure how well you can see it in the back, but the signatures are much clearer, much more readable and distinctive than the Stratford man's signature. Well, what about the Stratford man? What documentary evidence do we have of Shakespeare's life? Actually, there's quite a bit. We have about 70 documents that were made regarding him during his lifetime. And what do these documents tell us? Well, they tell us about his baptism, the date of his marriage, the birth of his children, his money-lending activities. They tell us about some lawsuits he was involved in. He would sue a neighbor over a shilling or so, although, of course, a shilling was worth a lot more in those days than it is now. Tax records. There's a time when he was fined for grain hoarding. Now, we do know he was a theater shareholder, and he did do some acting. There are 2 records of his having acted in plays, and he left bequests to some of his fellow actors in his will, and he died in 1616. These are what the documents from his life tell us. That basically covers most of the ground. But what they don't tell us is that he was any kind of a writer. There's no document from his lifetime that says that this man was a writer. Now, that seems a little odd. Also, I want to go back to Lewis Wright, the director of the Folger Library. And as I said before, he said that there's no evidence that Shakespeare did not write his plays or that anyone else wrote them. And he said that there's no evidence that would stand up in a court of law. Well, what he does say is that the facts are that he, Shakespeare, had a very good education acquired in the Stratford Grammar School. Now, years later, I looked back at those statements by Lewis Wright, and this one really kind of got to me because I can tell you this, there is no evidence that would stand up in a court of law that William Shakespeare of Stratford ever went to the Stratford Grammar School. Now, they did not keep records of students' names in those days, but still, there's no extrinsic evidence. Nobody ever wrote a letter saying, oh, I went to school with Shakespeare, who wrote that play Hamlet, or something like that. There's nothing that corroborates that he went to the Stratford Grammar School. And actually, since his parents were illiterate, it's likely that he might not have been able to get into it because you had to have some reading ability to get into the Stratford Grammar School. So we can't necessarily say that he ever went to that school. Now you might say, well, isn't there a lack of evidence of a literary career for other Elizabethan writers? A very good question. Maybe most of the evidence has been lost for other writers as well as the Stratford man. This occurred to the woman on the right here, Diana Price, and she wrote that book that's pictured on the left, Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, which was first published in 2001. And Diana Price started out as a defender of the Stratford theory, and then she started really looking into the Stratford man's life, and she said, well, there's no evidence of a literary career here. So she started looking for what she called a literary paper trail, not just for the Stratford man, but for 24 other Elizabethan writers, because she wanted to do a comparative study and see, well, maybe you can't find any evidence from his lifetime that Ben Jonson was a writer, or John Webster, or any other playwright of that time. So she did thorough research on all of these authors, and she was looking for things like this. Now, there's a list of 10 things here. I'm not going to go into all of them, but these would be things that would be indications during the person's life that he was a writer. Evidence of being paid to write, handwritten matters concerning literary work, miscellaneous records referring to the person as a writer. And she went through this entire list of 24 authors, and she noted the number of types of literary paper trail that she found for each one. And what I'm going to show you next is there's going to be a number next to each name, and that's the number of types of literary paper trail that she found for that person. Now, up at the top of the list is Ben Jonson, for whom there are all 10 types of literary paper trail. So his literary career is very well documented. And then the list goes on down. Eventually you get to John Webster, for whom there are only 3. But still, there's evidence from his lifetime that he was a writer. And then there's Shakespeare, for whom there's nothing. Interesting. Now, we can, of course, argue that, well, maybe all the evidence got lost, but it's odd that it would all be lost for that one person and not for these other 24 writers. Something still exists for all of them. So was this a literary man? Well, there's no evidence of education, as I said. No letter exists from him. And we know he was going back and forth between London and Stratford, so you'd think he would have written letters home sometime. No evidence that he ever owned a book. Now, in his will, which mentions all kinds of specific household items, like a bowl and a sword and the second best bed that he left to his wife, there's no mention of books or bookcases or desks. No musical instruments. There are a lot of references to music in Shakespeare's plays. So this all seems rather odd. And in those days, people would often list the books that they were leaving to other people by name in their wills. There's nothing of that in his will. No one in Stratford ever referred to him as a literary man during his lifetime. His son-in-law, a physician, and now this is very interesting to me, his son, John Hall, was married to his daughter, Susanna, and of course he was literate, as you had to be a physician, and he kept a detailed diary of his experiences, and when he met the poet-playwright Michael Drayton, he was sure to make a note of that in his diary. Never says anything in his diary about his father-in-law being a playwright. In fact, when his father-in-law dies, he just says something like, my wife's father died the other day. Nothing about the great playwright. So this all seems very odd. And when he died in 1616, there were no eulogies from other writers, no tributes. There was a great silence in England. It was basically a non-event to most of the country when he died. Now this is quite a contrast to today, which is 400 years after his death. And there are going to be all kinds of commemorations and celebrations and festivities in honor of the 400th anniversary of the death of this man that, from all we can tell, is just a Stratford grain merchant. So, here's Diana Price's challenge. She says, if writing plays were a crime, there wouldn't be enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that William Shakespeare was guilty. Now, whatever you may think, if you study the evidence and you think that Shakespeare was the author, that's fine with me. All I want people to take away from this, basically, is that there is room for reasonable doubt about the traditional theory. It's not a certain thing, and that it is something that's worth looking into. Now, some people might ask, what about references to Shakespeare's works by other writers in the 1590s and early 1600s? Don't those identify the Stratford man as the author William Shakespeare? Now, of course, the first work published under the name William Shakespeare was Venus and Adonis, a long narrative poem which was published in 1593. And when that was published, people started writing about it. They would say things about Shakespeare's style in Venus and Adonis, and Shakespeare's this and Shakespeare's that. But if you look carefully, you'll see that all of them are talking about the work. They're not talking about the man. Nobody ever says that they met Shakespeare or that they identify him with the Stratford man. They're simply talking about and critiquing the work. So just as you would write a book review, you might write a book review about somebody. It doesn't mean you know the person who wrote the book. You're just critiquing what the person said in his book. Now, Stanley Wells, who is a prominent Stratfordian professor, admitted that there was no evidence before 1623, which is when the first folio was published, that identifies the writer William Shakespeare with Stratford-upon-Avon. So there's no contemporary evidence. All the evidence is posthumous, starting 7 years after the Stratford man died. So on the question of was this a literary man, Hugh Trevor Roper, a history professor at Oxford, found that Shakespeare's elusiveness was exasperating and almost incredible. After all, he lived in the full daylight of the English Renaissance, in the well-documented reigns of Queen Elizabeth and King James I. Now, we know that the Elizabethans love to create documents. There are lots and lots of documents from the Elizabethan age. And of course, not everything is going to have survived. Some things got lost in fires or things like that. Rats might have eaten some of them. But there's still an awful lot of documentation from the Elizabethan age. that people have been sorting through in recent centuries. And Hugh Trevor Roper goes on to say, and since his death, since Shakespeare's death, has been subjected to the greatest battery of organized research that has ever been directed upon a single person. Now, what he's talking about there is that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, English scholars descended upon Stratford and village archives anywhere in England that they thought they might find anything that might help them to understand how this man from humble origins came to write these great plays. And of course, their reputations as academics would have been made if they had found something, but they found very little, and they found nothing that we would call a literary paper trail. Now, they did find one of those signatures of the Stratford man that I showed you earlier, but they didn't find anything that identified him as a writer. So, as Hugh Trevor Roper goes on to say, and yet the greatest of all Englishmen, after this tremendous inquisition, still remains so close to a mystery that even his identity can still be doubted. That was in '62 that he made that comment. Well, then why do people think that Shakespeare was Shakespeare? There are a few pieces of evidence, not too many, 3 or 4 pieces basically, but I'm going to just concentrate on what is by far the most important piece of evidence, and that is the first folio that was published in 1623. Now, let's talk about this book, the first folio. This was published in 1623, 7 years after the Stratford man died, and it has 36 Shakespeare plays in it, about half of which had never been published before. So we might not even know of them or know of their existence if the first folio hadn't been published. Well, how is it that it connects the Stratford man to the works of Shakespeare? Well, now Ben Jonson, the great Elizabethan playwright, wrote most of the prefatory material, and in one of those places he refers to Shakespeare as the sweet swan of Avon. Well, so there you have it. That's Stratford upon Avon, right? Except not quite so fast, because there are 5 rivers in England called Avon. Avon is the Saxon word for river. So referring to Avon doesn't necessarily pin it down to Stratford upon Avon. And also, British scholar Alexander Waugh has recently demonstrated that Avon was the ancient name for Hampton Court. And Hampton Court is the place where Shakespeare's plays were performed for Queen Elizabeth and later for King James I. So calling him the Swan of Avon could simply mean he is the person who wrote the plays that were performed at Hampton Court. So there's some ambiguity there. And of course with Ben Jonson, you've always got to be aware of the ambiguity. He was a master of it, maybe even more than Shakespeare was. Well, there's something else there, though. There's a mention of Stratford, thy Stratford monument. And of course, many of you, if you've been to Stratford, may have seen the monument that's in the Holy Trinity Church in Stratford of this man. So would that have pinned it down for people who lived in London and saw the first folio when it came out? Well, not exactly. There were at least 10 towns or villages named Stratford in England. And that must have been a nightmare for the Postal Delivery Service. They didn't have zip codes yet. Again, that doesn't exactly pin it down. There's some ambiguity there. And of course, the mention of Avon and the mention of Stratford are pages apart in the folio, so people might not connect them at all. But I think what's really most important about the first folio, and I could go on and on about the ambiguities in it, but I could spend a whole lecture on just that. But I think what's most interesting about it is the picture of the author that it tries to paint. And this starts with a line that probably everybody's familiar with. And it says of Shakespeare, "And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek." So it's basically saying this is not a man of great learning. He didn't know foreign languages very well. Maybe he knew a little bit, but this is not about somebody who had a great university education. And there's another passage that's even more telling, and this is supposedly written by Hemmings and Condell, who were 2 of Shakespeare's fellow actors. Now, just as an aside, critics going back to the 1700s have demonstrated pretty persuasively that Hemmings and Condell probably didn't actually write what was attributed to them. It was probably all ghostwritten for them by Ben Jonson. But aside from that, let's just take a look at what it says and take it at face value. It says, Shakespeare, as he was a happy imitator of nature, was a most gentle expresser of it. His mind and hand went together, and what he thought, he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. So here's basically the image that the first folio is trying to put forth. We've got this kind of simple country boy, didn't have much education, not a lot of book learning, and he just wrote what came into his head. It was almost like he was channeling the word of God, and he didn't have to go back and cross things out or revise things. It all just came out perfectly from his head. Well, that's kind of interesting, but is that really accurate about the person who would have written Shakespeare's plays? That he didn't have much education? That he didn't go back and revise things? Again, I'm going to Lewis Wright from the Folger Library. The facts are that the plays show no evidence of profound book learning. The plays show no evidence of profound book learning. I find that a very interesting statement. Here's why. And you can try this experiment. I've done this at the University of Miami Library. Go to some major library, like a university library, and go to the place where they keep the books on Shakespeare. You'll probably find several rows of shelves of books about Shakespeare, many of them analyzing and dissecting the plays, many others analyzing Shakespeare's knowledge of particular subjects. And I'll give you an example from my own experience. Now, as Margaret mentioned, I have taught a course called Shakespeare and the Law at the University of Miami School of Law. And we would spend a semester studying legal allusions, legal plot twists, legal references in Shakespeare's plays, 6 or 7 of his plays. And we spend a whole semester on that. There are about 50 books written on Shakespeare's knowledge of the law. And I can tell you from teaching a course on this that his knowledge of the law is very comprehensive. He understands law from the big picture. He also understands the tiny technical detail. And you could not teach a law school course on Ben Jonson's knowledge of law or Christopher Marlowe's knowledge of law or any other Elizabethan playwright, nor do people write books on those subjects. So it's quite hard to believe that the person who wrote these plays did not have formal legal training. And that is, of course, one of the points that particularly Mark Twain fastens on in his book, Is Shakespeare Dead? That the person who wrote them had to have studied the law, seriously, not just read a few things about it or discussed it with a few friends at a bar or something like that. And Shakespeare's knowledge of the law is really just the beginning, because people have written entire books on his knowledge of not just the law, but also medicine. And books on medicine in those days were usually written in Latin and Greek and were very expensive. People did not have them in their households for the most part. And by the way, a few years ago, I was at a Shakespeare conference and I heard a neurologist give a talk on Shakespeare's knowledge of neurology. So that's how technical and how precise Shakespeare's knowledge is to somebody who's an expert in the field. Other subjects on which people have written books about Shakespeare's knowledge: hunting, falconry. Falconry was an aristocratic sport. Commoners were not allowed to participate. Horsemanship, military life, military tactics, military equipment, philosophy, commedia dell'arte, navigation, classical mythology, folklore, biblical lore, plants and animals, agriculture and gardening, music, heraldry, precious stones, Italy, Greek drama, and yes, there are even 2 books on Shakespeare's knowledge of typography. Okay, no great book learning in the works, huh? Okay. All right. We'll go along with what Lewis Wright says. Now, here's the way I describe what I call the Shakespeare conundrum. In order to believe that Shakespeare was Shakespeare, it's necessary to suppose that the son of illiterate parents, and by the way, his children were illiterate too, for whom there's no evidence that he ever went to school, ever wrote a letter, or ever owned a book, somehow attained a world-class education that included fluency in several languages, a deep understanding of a great many technical subjects, the list I gave you just now before this, thereby becoming one of the most literate people of the Elizabethan age. In fact, whoever wrote Shakespeare's plays had to be one of the most literate people who ever lived, and gained all this knowledge without leaving a clue as to how he did it. Now, we don't say that a person from humble origins, like the man from Stratford, could not have somehow attained a terrific education, the education that a person would need to write the works of Shakespeare. But how did he do it without leaving a trace? There's no evidence, nothing in his handwriting or anything that shows that he was literate. So that's extremely hard to explain. Well, if Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, then who did? That is the question. So let's ask this question. Could William Shakespeare have been a pen name? Well, did people use pen names in those days? Why would they do that? Well, according to Taylor and Mosher, who wrote a seminal book on anonymous and pseudonymous writings, in the 16th and 17th centuries, which they refer to as the golden age of pseudonyms, almost every writer used a pseudonym at some time or other during his career. Here are some examples of Elizabethan pseudonyms. Martin Marprelate, that's somebody who was writing on religious topics. Cuthbert Currynave, Tom Telltruth. Now notice that all these names have hyphens in them, and although they were sometimes spelled without the hyphen, that was often a signal that the name was a pen name. And as I've mentioned, Shakespeare was sometimes also spelled with a hyphen. I think what's different about these from the name William Shakespeare is that these are more obviously made-up names, whereas William Shakespeare sounds more like it could be a real person's name. In fact, it's similar to a real person's name, such as William Shakespeare. So actually that would make it a better hiding place than one of these pseudonyms, which everybody's going to see that's a pseudonym, and people are going to try to figure out who's behind it. So let's say that you want to write and you want to have a pseudonym. Why would you pick the name Shakespeare? What's the reference there? Well, most likely it's a reference to the goddess Athena, the spear shaker, the goddess of wisdom, philosophy, arts, poetry, and music. And as I mentioned, the first works published under Shakespeare's name were two long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. So if you're planning to write some poems that have a philosophical bent to them, in which you want to express your wisdom, you might want to make your name a tribute to the goddess Athena. Now, what about the name William? Well, that comes from the German Wilhelm, the Latin Gulielmus, French Guillaume, and the Old Dutch Gildhelm, which means golden helmet. And as you can see here, the goddess Athena is often pictured with a golden helmet. So that would all fit together. That would make sense if you're going to be a writer and you're going to be writing poetry. Well, who might have been writing under the pen name William Shakespeare? Well, a lot of people have been suggested. Sir Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke. And actually a lot of other people have been mentioned, and some people say, well, there's so many candidates that shows that there's really no issue there. But actually, the reason so many other people have been mentioned as possible authors is that almost everyone who's been mentioned is much more likely to have written the plays than the man from Stratford. Now, I think there are only a few that really hold up, that sound plausible if you examine them closely. And these 5 that I've shown here are probably some of the more plausible ones. And I'm going to get into what I think is the best argument for who wrote Shakespeare, and it was written by a man named J. Thomas Loney in 1920, and he wrote a book called Shakespeare Identified. Now, you'll notice the way he spells his name, it's got 2 O's in it. So it could be pronounced Looney, although my understanding is that he pronounced it Loney. And unfortunately, when the book came out, people who wanted to criticize it did not bother to actually deal with his argument or analyze it or find flaws in it. They just simply said, well, the man's loony, so what he's saying, it can't be true. And of course, that's not a real argument, as any rational adult can tell. So let's look a little bit at what he did when he wrote this book, Shakespeare Identified. And it's interesting that the novelist John Galsworthy referred to this as the best detective story I ever read. And he did use a detective's techniques. Basically, he created a profile of 18 characteristics that he believed the real author must have. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Loney. He was a schoolmaster. He taught Shakespeare for many years in England to boys at what we'd call the high school level. And so he's very familiar with the works, and he'd come to believe that it just couldn't possibly be the Stratford man for many of the reasons that I've explained here. So just going by the works, which is all he had, he made this list of characteristics. Now, I'm not showing all 18 here. I'm just going to touch on a few of them. He thought it had to be a mature man of recognized genius, somebody who was not adequately appreciated in his time, an enthusiast for Italy. There are quite a few Shakespeare plays that are set in Italy. So he thought that the person must have to know something about Italy. He was loose and improvident in money matters and conflicted in his attitude toward women. Now that last one is probably based on lines like, "Frailty, thy name is woman," and of course the attitude that the author has for the dark lady of the sonnets, which is conflicted, I think is the word. So anyway, he talked about circumstantial evidence as the kind of evidence he was looking for. And by the way, I am a lawyer, as Margaret mentioned, and I can tell you this: in a court of law, you can prove a case, most of the time, completely with circumstantial evidence. So if you've got a lot of circumstantial evidence, it may very well be enough to prove your case. And Loney gave his definition of circumstantial evidence, and as a lawyer, I think it's a very good definition, very astute. He said, "Circumstantial evidence is in practice the most reliable proof we have. The predominating element in what we call circumstantial evidence is that of coincidences. A few coincidences we may treat as simply interesting. A number of coincidences we regard as remarkable. A vast accumulation of extraordinary coincidences we accept as conclusive proof. There does become a point when it's just too many coincidences. You can't explain it any other way than one certain way." So he goes on to say, "It's not upon any point separately, but upon the manner in which all fit in with one another and form a coherent whole that the case rests." Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you who it was that Loney thought wrote Shakespeare's plays, and I'm going to give you quite a bit of circumstantial evidence, although I can't get into all of it in this short period of time. I could go on for hours with it. But of course, the first piece of evidence that I show you, you'll probably think, "Oh, well, that doesn't prove anything." And you'll be right, because it doesn't, not by itself. Circumstantial evidence works cumulatively, so you really got to look at all the evidence. And then when you find there are just too many coincidences to explain away, that's when you start to think that maybe you're on the right track. So the person that Loney found fit all of the characteristics he was looking for, and he was the only person who even came close, was Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. So the question is, did Edward de Vere write the plays of Shakespeare? Well, I'm going to give you some circumstantial evidence. First of all is a book called The Art of English Poesy, which was published in 1589. Now, let me just mention first of all that this book was published anonymously. We don't know who wrote it. There are a lot of theories about who wrote it, and people have arguments about it was this person or that person, but there's actually an authorship question about the art of English poesy. And that's not uncommon when you look at the Elizabethan age, because so many things were published anonymously or under pseudonyms. But the author of The Art of English Poesy, whoever he was, or she, said, "I know very many notable gentlemen in the court that have written commendably, and suffered it to be published without their own names to it." Suffered, of course, meaning allowed. So basically what he's saying is that he knew of notable gentlemen in the court that have published things either anonymously or under a pseudonym. They didn't have their own names on it, as if it were a discredit for a gentleman to seem learned. Now, this gets to one of the mores of the day, and that is that it was all right for a nobleman to publish a serious work, like, say, a treatise on philosophy or religion or something like that, maybe science. That was befitting a nobleman, but poetry was considered frivolous. That was something you did in your spare time, or what they called your idle hours. And if you were a nobleman and you wrote poetry, you would probably have it in manuscript form, and you would pass it around among your friends, but you wouldn't have it published. And plays, well, that was even worse than poetry. That was beneath poetry. The playhouses were scandalous places where there was thievery and prostitution and gambling going on, and so no nobleman would want to be associated with that. Now, the author of The Art of English Poesy goes on to say, there are noblemen who have written excellently well, as it would appear, if their doings could be found out and made public with the rest, of which number is first that noble gentleman, Edward, Earl of Oxford. Now, right here, we have a contemporary reference during Oxford's life, somebody saying that he's a writer. In fact, a few of his early poems had gotten out and had been published. We don't know if they were with his permission or not, but we do have some early poems that he wrote. That's not the only references to Oxford as a writer during his lifetime. 1598, Francis Mears said that Oxford was one of the best writers of comedy. Okay, really interesting. We don't have any comedies that have come down to us under his name. So that's kind of interesting. Here are some other pieces of circumstantial evidence regarding Oxford. In 1578, and this was long before anything was published under the name William Shakespeare, Gabriel Harvey, in a Latin oration which was presented in Queen Elizabeth's presence, said of Oxford, Voltus tella vibrat, which I'm told by people who understand Latin better than I do, can be translated as, thy will shakes spears, or thy countenance shakes spears. So this may be something that gave Oxford the idea for using the pen name Shakespeare later on. We know that he was a patron of the arts. He loved poetry and drama. He commissioned many books, and 28 books were dedicated to him during his lifetime. Now, that's more than were dedicated to anybody else in the Elizabethan age except Queen Elizabeth herself. Several of his youthful poems survive, and I think that you can see in them the seeds of Shakespeare's sonnets, although they're certainly not as polished and sophisticated as the sonnets, but we believe that the sonnets were written in his maturity. He had two theater troupes, a men's troupe and a boys' troupe. Now, you often hear, oh, well, we think that the Stratford man had to do it because he was a man of the theater. Well, so was Oxford. In fact, we have more evidence of Oxford being associated with theater performance than we do for the Stratford man. He leased the Blackfriars Theatre in the 1580s, and Blackfriars Theatre was later associated with Shakespeare's plays. He did an extensive tour of Italy when he was in his mid-20s, including most of the cities that are featured in Shakespeare's plays. We know that one of the primary influences on Shakespeare is Ovid's Metamorphoses. And there was a particular translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses that Shakespeare seems to have been very fond of, and there are echoes of it again and again in his works. And this translation was translated by Arthur Golding, who just happened to be Oxford's uncle. And Oxford and Golding were living in the same household at the time that Golding was working on this translation. And speaking of Ovid's Metamorphoses, as I mentioned, the first work published under the name William Shakespeare was the narrative poem Venus and Adonis, based on a story by Ovid. Now, what you see here on the left is a painting of the Venus and Adonis story by the great Venetian writer Titian. Venetian painter Titian. And he had several different versions of this, some that were a little bit different from each other. A few of the copies of this were in the possession of the King of Spain. There's one that's really quite different from all the others, and it's this one. Because as you can see, Adonis is wearing a type of hat called a bonnet. So I'm going to go back, that's the earlier one. Here's the one with the bonnet, and that was in Titian's studio in Venice. And it's interesting that Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis has a reference to Adonis wearing a bonnet, which suggests that the author may have been inspired by this particular painting, which he could have only seen in Venice. And we don't have any evidence of the Stratford man ever leaving England. We know that Oxford spent about 10 months of his life in Venice. That was basically his headquarters when he was touring Italy. So he very likely might have had entree to Titian's studio and seen that. On the left here, we have a picture of an actor playing Polonius in Hamlet. And it's long been recognized that in many ways Polonius is a caricature or a satire of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who was probably the most powerful man in England during Elizabeth's time. He was Queen Elizabeth's right-hand man. He had his own spy network. And of course, you may remember in Hamlet that Polonius sends a servant to go spy on his son while he's away at school. And Burleigh did exactly the same thing when his son was away at school, sent one of his servants to go spy on him, see what he was up to. Well, so did Oxford know Lord Burleigh? Well, as a matter of fact, when Oxford was 12, his father died, and he became a ward of the Queen, and he was sent to live in Lord Burleigh's household. So, yes, you might say he knew him. Not only that, but later on, he married Lord Burleigh's daughter, Anne Cecil, and so Burleigh was his father-in-law. So they had a lifelong relationship, and not a very easy one, because they were very different personalities, and they butted heads with each other quite often. On the left, we have some pirates, and you may recall that there's a plot twist in Hamlet where Hamlet is captured by pirates and left naked on the shore of Denmark. Well, Oxford, when he was crossing the English Channel, was captured by pirates who left him naked on the shore of England. Probably just a coincidence. Yeah. Then there's a famous line in Hamlet, young men falling out at tennis, which is probably a reference to a quarrel, a famous quarrel that occurred between Oxford and Sir Philip Sidney. Now, Oxford and Sir Philip Sidney were big rivals. They disagreed on poetry and drama and politics and a lot of things. And one day, Sidney was playing tennis with some of his friends, and Oxford came along and asked if he could join in. And Sidney just ignored him at first. Not a good move because Oxford outranked him. So anyway, eventually it got into a verbal altercation, and Oxford ended up calling Sidney a puppy. So, of course, Sir Philip Sidney went to war. He died a hero. He was buried as a national hero. Oxford could not make fun of him openly, but he could make fun of him covertly in the plays. And, for example, Sir Andrew Aguecheek in Twelfth Night is probably a very mean satire on Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney had pockmarks from the ague, and so that would be where the Aguecheek came from. And of course, Sir Andrew Aguecheek is a fop and a dandy, which Sir Philip Sidney was probably not, at least his friends would have said so. But that's the way Oxford saw him. And there are other characters in Shakespeare's plays that are probably satires on Sir Philip Sidney, his great rival. On the left here, we have Henry Wriothesley, who was the third Earl of Southampton. And this is the person to whom the two long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, are expressly dedicated. His name is on the title page. And he also may be, it's not as clear, he may be the fair youth that is addressed in the sonnets. Now, the sonnets don't say specifically that it's him like the other two poems do, but that is probably a plausible guess. Well, now, why would Oxford, if he were Shakespeare, why would he have written these sonnets to Southampton? Well, as it turns out, around the time the sonnets were probably written, early 1590s, Southampton was being put forth as a husband to Oxford's eldest daughter. And of course, she was Lord Burleigh's granddaughter. Lord Burleigh was very much pushing Southampton to marry Oxford's daughter. So it makes a lot more sense to think that Oxford would have written these poems to Southampton than to think that the Stratford man would have written them. As you may recall, the first 17 sonnets are all urging the young man to get married. So that's exactly what was going on around that time. The devil can cite scripture for his own purpose. That is, of course, a line from Merchant of Venice. And that picture of the book that you see there, that is Oxford's Geneva Bible, which is now residing in the Folger Library in D.C. And Oxford made a lot of notations in that Bible. And a scholar named Roger Strittmatter, several years ago, wrote his PhD dissertation on correlations between biblical references in Shakespeare's plays and Oxford's notations in his Geneva Bible. And what he found was that the more often a biblical passage is referred to in Shakespeare's plays, the more likely it is to have been something that Oxford underlined or made a notation about in his Geneva Bible. King Lear. Well, now as you know, King Lear gave his kingdom to his 3 daughters while he lived, which turned out not to be a good move. And well, Oxford had 3 daughters, but that's hardly a strong coincidence. Lots of people have 3 daughters. But there actually is a bit of more of a parallel to it than that, because Oxford had to put his family estate in trust for the benefit of his 3 daughters while he lived. Somewhat similar to what Lear did. Baptista Minola is the name of the character who's the father of Kate and Bianca in Taming of the Shrew. Well, where did Shakespeare get that name? Well, just as a coincidence, when Oxford was traveling in Italy, he borrowed money from 2 men. One was named Baptista Negroni, and the other was named Pasquino Spinola. So it suggests that Oxford might have taken these names and kind of squished them together and come up with the name Baptista Minola, who was also a rich man. That's why people wanted to marry his daughters in Taming of the Shrew. Merchant of Venice. Antonio, the merchant, borrows 3,000 ducats from Shylock, the moneylender, so that Bassanio, pictured here, played by Joseph Fiennes, can marry Portia. Oxford borrowed not 3,000 ducats, but 3,000 pounds from a moneylender named not Shylock, but Michael Locke, so that he could send ships to look for a passage to India through the northwest, which they didn't find, by the way. And finally, this is from The Winter's Tale. You may recall that there's a statue of Queen Hermione that is shown in that play. And someone remarks on it that it's a piece many years in doing and now newly performed by that rare Italian master, Giulio Romano. Now, Giulio Romano is the only artist who is mentioned in all of Shakespeare's works. And many critics have gotten on Shakespeare's case since then and said, wait a minute, Shakespeare did not know his Italian masters because Giulio Romano was a painter, not a sculptor. Except Shakespeare was right and they were wrong. Giulio Romano was not just a painter, he was also a sculptor. Here is one of his sculptures on a tomb in Mantua, which is an area that was along the line of travels that Oxford would have been traveling when he was in Italy. Now, people have asked me this, why does it matter who wrote Shakespeare? And I can understand that feeling. You know, you can read the works and not really think about who wrote them, not have to know anything about them, and you can still get a lot out of them. But I think that the answer to this was very well summed up by Michael Delahoyte, who's a professor at Washington State University. And he says, if you get Shakespeare wrong, you get literature wrong, and probably you get the very phenomenon of creativity wrong. Because the Stratfordians and the Oxfordians have very opposing views about how these works were created. To the Stratfordians, it's all just something that came into his head. He just wrote what he thought and didn't have to go back and cross anything out. Well, actually, it's not true that nothing had to be crossed out. I mean, there are different versions of many of the plays. You've heard of the first quarto and second quarto of some of these plays. There are different versions that conflict with each other quite a bit. We have 3 different versions of Hamlet. So obviously these were revised. But also, to the Stratfordians, the creation of these plays was kind of an impersonal act. You know, it didn't really have anything to do with him. It was all out of his imagination. And it's really no sweat, no labor involved. Oxfordians think that, yes, imagination is an important part of creating these works, but Oxford also was pouring his heart and soul into these plays. He was talking about his disappointments, about his triumphs, about his fears, about his sins a lot of the time. A lot of times he seems to be trying to expiate some of his sins that he committed when he was in his younger days. So you may hear people say that writers write what they know. Well, according to the Stratfordians, the exception to that is Shakespeare. But to the Oxfordians, that is true of Oxford. He was writing what he knew. His experience, his vast education, and his imagination as well were poured into these plays. And that's why it's important to understand who actually wrote them. Now, there are a few books you might want to follow up on, and by the way, I'm going to pass out a list that has some websites and some books that you can look at if you want to follow up on this. This is a good book, Shakespeare by Another Name. That's about a 400-page biography of Oxford as Shakespeare, written by Mark Anderson. Very good. Shakespeare's Guide to Italy, written by Richard Roe, doesn't really mention the Oxford theory, but he talks about going back to Italy. He fought in Italy in World War II. He goes back there with the copies of the Shakespeare plays in hand, and he finds actual places that the author had to be talking about that are still there. And he really makes the point that Shakespeare knew Italy very intimately, and a lot of the details of Italy are in his plays. And then Alias Shakespeare by Joseph Sobran, also a very good book, a bit shorter than the Mark Anderson book, but a good explanation of the Oxfordian theory. And I'd like to end with a quotation from Sigmund Freud, and this is something that Freud wrote shortly after reading Thomas Loney's book, Shakespeare Identified, which, as I said, was published in 1920. And Sigmund Freud said, "I no longer believe that the actor from Stratford was the author of the works that have been ascribed to him. The man of Stratford seems to have nothing at all to justify his claim, whereas Oxford has almost everything." Thank you.